Okay, our next plenary session of the day is called Harnessing Data and Tech to Achieve Common Urban Goals. In it, we're going to be asking the questions, how can cities leverage big data, and how can we use data for long-range planning? I'd like to welcome to the stage our chair for today. It's Dr. Mara Balestrini, who's CEO of Ideas for Change, Senior Research Fellow at FabLab Barcelona, and co-founder of Salus Group. Please put your hands together for Dr. Balestrini.
Go. I thought you were supposed to go. Hello, everybody. I'm so honored to be chairing this amazing panel today on how we can harness the potential of data and the Internet of Things and exponential technologies to address urban challenges and to foster long-term planning. Obviously, there is huge potential around data. With data, we could completely transform the management of cities. We could increase participation. We could make cities more efficient. But also, there are challenges. For example, the privacy of citizens, the articulation of different data sets, and how to not end up having data in lots of different silos. The great thing is that I'm not going to be talking about this by myself. I've got a stellar panel today that will help us discuss these issues truly from the bottom up. We will start talking about hardware with Ravi Sirigineedi, and then we will go into software and how software and platforms can help articulate hardware and services with Jaimes Burke. Then we will go on to the topic of services with Andrés Camacho. And Andrew Collinge will be discussing city as a system. And then finally, with Francesca Bria, we will be discussing the turn to the civic, the turn to the commons, and how participation can also be one of the key elements in this topic today. So the other important thing that you need to know is that there is this application called Ask and Vote. And through that app, you can send questions that will be later addressed by us here. So we will begin with a 3-minute idea sharing by Ravi. Ravi is working with Intel. He's a global segment marketing manager who's been working on IoT for retail solutions for many years now. Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you, Mara. Good morning, everybody. I hope all of you are having a great show here. It's the third day of the show. In this Congress, you already heard this phrase, data is the new oil. I'll be at the risk of sounding cliched, I'll say that as well, and I completely agree. After oil, or oil being replaced as the most valuable resource, I completely believe that data is the new oil, right? And you don't have to take my word for that. Actually, if you go around the show today, you see companies like MasterCard, companies like Mobileye, in their own regard, exemplifying as to what I mean by that, right? They're taking data streams from all possible sources and all possible avenues to put it all together. And one might ask, why is data so important? Is all data important? I would basically say, data that is actionable, data that you can use to basically drive some business decisions, and data that you can use to provide social impact, especially in the case of smart cities, to be able to offer social impact to the citizens. Those are some of the things that I see day in, day out. Cities, solution providers, helping the cities do some of those and put them into exercise. Some of the examples, you might or might not have seen them, but yesterday I heard City of San Diego sharing their story about the smart street lights that they have implemented. And through the implementation of those street lights, how they have been able to gather a lot of intelligent data about pedestrians on the sidewalks, bicyclists crossing the sidewalks, and be able to use that data to be able to drive better traffic management by, and the insights is really what they are looking into to be able to drive some of those actions, which result in some of the meeting the key performance indicators that cities typically look for. A couple of other examples, you might have seen some of the kiosks that are sitting on the sides of streets. Those are prime areas for a lot of pedestrians, a lot of ongoers to share a lot of intelligent information about them, and then be able to use that information and do some valuable transactions, data transactions. And then how is Intel and companies like Intel, the technology companies, how are they helping to make this all possibility? And that is where Internet of Things comes into play. Having all of these devices, from the simple sensor all the way up to a very complex kiosk or a smart light pole, how do you make them all talk to each other? How do you connect them? How do you manage all of the data that's flowing back and forth? How do you secure all of the data? That's really what the Internet of Things is all about. And that's what technology companies are expected to, and we are striving to make sure that we drive them in a very tightly integrated manner. So that way, companies and solution providers can address some of the city needs. They are ready, and we hope and wish for cities to act on it and basically take advantage of what these companies have to offer and basically unleash the value of data and technology. So those would be my few thoughts. Thank you, Mara.
Thank you, Ravi. So Jaime Burke, he is the CEO and founder of Outlier Ventures. This is the first ventures fund for the blockchain technologies that was created in 2013. So Jaime has been for many years now one of the key voices in helping us all understand what the blockchain is and what opportunities it brings for the context of technology in cities. So I would like to know from you, Jaime, what can software and particular blockchain and technologies like AI do to articulate hardware and city services or experiences?
So firstly, I have to clarify, we weren't the first fund, sadly. We were the first in Europe.
In Europe, yeah.
Small, people will be ranting at me on Twitter if I try to get away with that one. So we focus on something called the convergence thesis, which is looking at blockchain as a foundational layer to the next phase of the web. And that's where blockchain converges with other deep technologies like AI, IoT. So I'm very lucky to have had somebody come on stage and explain what blockchain is before I start talking. So you're all blockchain experts now, I'm sure. So going to the kind of meta theme of the panel in the presentation, which was around leveraging big data for long-term planning. So just to be contrarian, I want to kind of challenge that. I don't believe anybody wants big data. And I also think what we should be aspiring to achieve is not long-term planning. So what I think people want are intelligent systems. And they want those systems to be usable, and they want them to be responsive to and dynamic to what's going on within that system. And so if you look at the status quo today, what we actually have are largely dumb devices, so they're not smart devices, they're pretty dumb. We have very large data lakes. People have got more data than they know what to do with. And this kind of leads to very messy environments and actually very fragile systems. So when something goes wrong in that system, usually it requires human intervention. So the kind of flip side of that is that what people are being offered from an AI perspective is largely a dependency upon a handful of corporate monopolies. And so we're kind of stuck in between a hard place. On the one hand, we have a very messy, fragile system. On the other hand, we have this massive compromise to have anything that's remotely intelligent. And I think the convenience of the latter option is an existential threat. Now, fortunately, I think there's a third way, and that's kind of hopefully what I'll be able to talk about today, which is This decentralized environment that the lady was speaking about just prior to us coming on stage offers an environment where, firstly, it can be decentralized, value can be better distributed, and through things called ICOs or initial coin offerings, value can be tokenized in these systems. So that means that ownership can be fractionalized. And when blockchain is combined with AI, what that means is we can have a database where the value is distributed, both in terms of how it's generated and how it's owned, that can inform AIs that can make these systems more intelligent, but importantly, those AIs can be almost a commons, an AI commons. So this is kind of the thing that's most important to me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jaime. So that's a very interesting point on, do we really want, now that we have all this data, do we want long-term planning, really, or we want to use the data to be more responsive, right? Third, we have Andrés Camacho. Andrés Camacho is the Innovation and Change Director at Ferrovial Services. And maybe, Andrés, you can, we've already talked about hardware and a bit of software. How can this come together to help deliver better services in cities?
Thank you, Mara. Well, I am a firm believer that the way services have been performed for cities is going to change dramatically. I'm talking about here, just to put a bit of context, I'm talking about services like waste collection, street cleansing, road maintenance, facility management for public buildings like hospitals or universities. These are all services that haven't really changed for decades, and very labor-intensive. More input means more output, and really delivered in a way in which the citizen haven't had a say in the way the services are delivered. They would go and vote every 4 years to choose the local political representatives, but they wouldn't have any connection with the service delivery providers, like, for example, Ferrovial Services. So this is about to change with the use of data and all the associated technology. And I can think of at least 3 ways in which data is going to transform services in the cities. The first is with really a quantum leap in operational efficiency. And whereas before you would be happy with having 3–4% gains every year, I think now in one go we can get efficiencies of 50% in operational efficiency. This means using CapEx and labor in a much smarter way. We have a good example of this in the city of Granada, where we have a pilot that we are working together with Cisco and the city of Granada. By using sensors and using also data like traffic, weather, events, all sorts of data, you put it in and use it in a smart way, and you can reroute, you can think on a dynamic way how you want to pick up the waste. And this seems very basic, but by doing it using data and being able to do it in a dynamic way, you can save a lot of money. A second way where I think data will change service delivery is with new business models. New business models that before they were not feasible, and now they are there, and in some countries they're actually happening, like, for example, waste collection on demand. And for that, you need a lot of data to make it efficient and viable from an economic point of view. And third, which is probably, it's less technological, but not for that less important, is that now the citizen is empowered. Is empowered because they have more and more data and they want to use it. And they can put political pressure on politicians on a daily basis, where before that didn't matter, or they can actually interact with people like us, and before they didn't have the option to do that. And we have a pilot in Madrid, for example, in which we are working to think how we can clean streets. And this is, again, very basic, but we can clean streets in a different manner, understanding what is the satisfaction from a citizen point of view. So definitely, I think it's still early days, but the change is coming.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrés. Well, and following, we have Andrew Collinge. Andrew is the Smart City Lead and Assistant Director in Intelligence and Analysis from the Greater London Authority. And he also, among other many things, he's responsible for the London Datastore of the GLA. And I think this puts us in a perfect moment now to ask you, clearly we're seeing how this data can be harnessed at the city level to run services more efficiently, to reduce costs and so on. So what is the experience of London in terms of harnessing the potential of data to improve life for Londoners?
Maura, thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and set out a few short examples and really try to, I think, examine what the role of government should and should not be in this space, because you know, I've got my own little blockchain test and I probably understood about 50% of what Jamie actually said, but you know, maybe that's right, I don't know. Those examples about where in London we're trying to use data and disciplines like machine learning to address public policy challenges that are shared across all the municipal authorities in the city. One of the things that we're concentrating on really hard at the moment is air quality or clean air, and they're using data science to understand how we configure new sensor networks to fit in between the high-quality monitoring stations that we have at the moment, the things that I called Rolls-Royces parked far apart, that are, which number about 100 in a city like London. And these are placed close to roads because we've considered air pollution to be a traffic problem, when in fact actually, given the way that sensor technology is coming down in price, the data that it can measure is improving in terms of its quality, we need to consider how we address that sort of pressing public health, public policy challenge in a place like London using data science. And there we're working with the Alan Turing Institute. We've recently carried out an experiment with Transport for London as well, collecting 510 million pieces of media access call-out data from people as they travel around the tube network. And that's really interesting for us because it requires us to take the discussion about how people's data is used to the community, to the traveling community, and to work with the Information Commissioner in doing so. So quite a sort of regulatory stroke ethical dimension to that exercise, which is also about gathering data so that we can deliver the next generation of sort of transport information improvements, and indeed how we sort of use that asset more effectively. I also want to talk as well just about, I suppose, the cultural change that I think is required on the demand side in amongst the 33 municipal authorities that sit underneath the Greater London Authority. And this is where I do bring out my sort of proper blockchain test. When you ask the political leadership and indeed the managerial leadership of those organisations which serve big communities in the way that has already been described, whether they've heard of the blockchain, they all put their hands in the air. When you ask them what the blockchain does, they might talk a little bit about cryptocurrencies and distributed ledgers. But when you say, how can blockchain affect your key lines of business and the relationships that you have with the communities that you serve, nada. Absolutely nothing comes back. And that, I think, is a situation that in 2017 has to change. I'm a strong believer that public authorities have to have a stronger appreciation of technology than they currently do at the moment. That's important because issues like cybersecurity as smart city applications that individually are secure, when you place them together, they potentially become insecure, and that's a risk politically. And also as well, there are these new business models emerging. Sidewalk Labs work in Toronto and the redevelopment of the waterfront and data extractivism, really interesting challenges for government. So I think we need a new deal on data as well, and that includes all parties, from private sector players, big and large, right the way through to citizens.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. That creates a perfect segue, following with Francesca Bria, the CTO of Barcelona, Chief Technology and Innovation Officer of Barcelona. So basically, Andrew has discussed a number of issues that I think are very, very relevant. You need, for you, for example, to deploy a citizen sensing protocol, you need to make sure the data is interoperable and that you can use different sources of data, right? And that the usage of these sources of data is not violating any licenses and is not risking people's privacy and so on. He has also talked about political leadership. Francesca has made it to the front lines for very strong leadership in terms of pushing forward a new data deal for Barcelona. So what does this mean, and how is this so fundamental for running data projects within the City Council?
Let me first make two reflections on what I heard, and also two more high-level thoughts that I have. So first of all, I think we need to create a very positive narrative, and I think we have a renaissance opportunity in Europe, now I will say like that. From a governance and political standpoint, I think we have to use as much as possible as an opportunity in a positive sense what's coming up in Europe, which is the GDPR. So I've heard a lot of complaints about the new data protection legislation, and more like a narrative of fear. How can we respect privacy, what it means for companies to be able to deal with data with all these complex processes. I think this is a great opportunity for Europe to take back data sovereignty and build the systems that we need, which are privacy preserving, rights enhancing, and decentralized, yes. And I think on top of that, we can build an economy that really serves the purpose of Europe and with the values. And I think the question of citizen rights in this space, security, data protection, the new digital rights are very important. And we can make that the competitive advantage to use data for a better society in Europe. So I think this is my first point. The second point, which is counterintuitive, is that I think we are under-innovating. I think that we have a fantastic opportunity in the fourth industrial revolution if we move away from data extractivism, which is the current business model of the digital age, where data ends up only in the hands of very, very few players, mainly actually big multinational companies based in the US, not in Europe. And this data doesn't have the digital economy, I think, it lacks a direction. So we need to, I mean, we are desperately in need of innovating in the future fields that the society need. Sustainability, the Green Deal, you know, green cities, healthcare, we need better healthcare systems, we need better education, and that's where we are not investing. And I think if we move from data extractivism to a system that socializes data more and make data open for communal use so that we can unleash the power of citizens, the power of social entrepreneurs, the power of our companies and our local industry, and then we can really give some direction to this technological revolution. Now, I want to make some example of what we're doing here in Barcelona. First of all, I think cities have a dramatic importance in this space. In Barcelona, we are creating some ethical digital standards for this. And so we are mandating data sovereignty in big contracts, like mainly big IT contracts, where it's clear the data belong to the citizens. And this is another point that for us is very dear, to recognize as public sector and also as companies, so I would like to know your thoughts on that the majority of data that we aggregate today belong to you, to us, to the citizens. And so we have to be able to give back the power to the citizens to decide what data they want to share, with whom, on what basis, and for what purpose. And then to create what we call here, which is city data commons, a new class of data, which is data commons, on top of which we can build next generation data-driven services, which are privacy protecting, rights respecting, more decentralized, and also that help us achieve the big challenges that we have. Actually the European Commission is launching a very big prize on blockchain for the social good. 5 million euros will be put out there for social enterprises, innovators, startups, all the people here with great idea to use distributed technologies to actually help us achieve the big social goals that we have. Here in Barcelona, we are also joining a program which is, I think, interesting with NUMA, which is Data City Challenges, where we use data as a public good, as an infrastructure, and we ask companies to work together with the city hall to address mobility questions, corruption questions, question of energy, and other problems that we have in the city. And I think I want to make some also really examples on how you can use data in a meaningful way. You know, what also Andrew was saying. cases where we can show that data matters, that is important to actually use data to improve decision-making and services for the citizens. And time is up, no? Am I okay? Yes, actually very much up. Okay, then I just make one example which is interesting. First of all, using data to fight corruption and transparency that we haven't talked about very much, but we're doing a lot of work which is interesting in this respect. And then also data for democracy. So we have a participatory democracy platform, an online platform here, the city in Barcelona, where citizens are using data to understand what are the most important issues in the city, how they can use the budget to spend collaborative budget to address some of the issues, and then they can use visualization to better participate in the policy life of the city. So a really participatory democracy that's data-driven, and where the data is up there available for everybody to use.
Brilliant. Ravi, thank you, Francesca. Ravi, Francesca and Andrew have posed some questions for private companies like Intel. So as part of your work, you deploy sensors that collect data, potentially about people behaviors and so on. How can cities, and we see cities moving towards this role of being custodians of people's data and preserving digital rights and privacy. So how do you see this, the role of companies in this context? Because you obviously also need data.
Absolutely. So from an Intel and other technology companies that we interface with, there is definitely a lot of room for innovation. Technology companies love challenges, and challenges like these is what drives us to innovate more. So if you can see some of the topics about sensors and the number of sensors that cities would like to incorporate to gather more data and gather some insights from it, there is a plethora of them that can be splattered throughout. But companies need to provide more tightly integrated solutions, a solution that has a platform solution that has room for a lot of sensors to be plugged in from day one, and down the road, if you want to plug in more, it has to be in an expandable manner, right? They have to be energy efficient. They have to be secure, so that way all of the data that is being either collected or analyzed at the hardware and the platform level, it needs to be secure, so that way there is no improper access to that data or something that you do not desire to see happen, right? So those are some of the challenges that we take at a very, very fundamental level, and we drive hardware and software solutions working with our partners to deliver things that are, like I talked earlier about, connected, managed, and secure. Those are the three fundamental pillars which we strive towards to minimize the footprint of some of these vast portion of sensors lying around, and you referred to earlier, Mara, as e-waste, and those are the things that we take as a challenge and try to address them on a day-to-day basis. So there is several examples that I can relate to, but one close to most of you. The Transportation Authority over here implemented a digital signage network in all of their buses to improve the passenger experience. This was 4 years back. This was not yesterday. This was 4 years back. And they have been so innovative, so visionary, that they have taken platforms which can be remotely managed, for example, meaning no operator needs to go to each bus, or the bus doesn't need to go back to the depot whenever that network is down. So somebody can remotely, sitting in one control room, access all of those machines and be able to diagnose it, repair it, and manage it. Those are some of the innovations that cities have already adopted, but we have built upon that and starting to build and provide more capabilities for the cities to leverage.
There's obviously the challenge of data integrity in that sense. You need to be aggregating lots of layers of data to manage crucial services like the transport service. So what can the blockchain, Jamie, do, and this idea of convergence to enable the interoperability, but at the same time support data integrity and privacy and security? Is there anything that can be done?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to state that whilst there's a lot of hype around blockchain in terms of the applications and uses, we're still building the fundamental architecture and foundations for it. So most of those use cases just aren't possible today, or at least not economically viable on things like Ethereum. So the kind of building blocks that have been being put in place at the moment, actually one of the key things to start with is around identity and reputation. And that's not just of people, it's also things, devices. So the quality of the output from data is dictated to by the quality of the input as well. So there are a number of innovations, and I'm going to do some shameless plugs, because obviously we invest in the space. So there's something called IOTA, the IOTA Foundation, which have built a protocol specifically for IoT devices, whereby each device is a node that processes the transactions of the other nodes in the network, removing a lot of the waste and inefficiencies of conventional mining that you see in Bitcoin and what have you. So this is going to fundamentally allow IoT devices to effectively create data marketplaces. And through the use of tokenization in that system, it enables you to monetize it. But linking that to identity solutions, so another investment we made is in something called Sovereign. Sovereign enables what are called verifiable claims. So the concept is that identity is just a series of claims, and varying degrees of trust about who verifies those claims. And they've created, again, and all of these things are open source protocols, by the way, which I think is a really important point here. So anybody can innovate with them, anybody can customize them, and anybody can alter them and experiment with them. So, but on the identity solution, effectively it enables you to have a spectrum of privacy. So you can have totally anonymous transactions and transfer of data between people, organizations, and things. Or you can do, you can reveal certain truths about the state of a set of data or a financial transaction in what's called a zero knowledge proof environment. So basically, you only have to reveal the minimum amount of information to prove a verification true or false. And so the combination of something like IOTA, which enables you to connect up devices and create data marketplaces, with something like Sovereign, which enables both the device to have an identity and to make transactions or have questions asked of its data sets with people, whilst preserving privacy and enabling self-sovereign ownership of the data and the output. But these are all very new initiatives, and often when people look at blockchain as a kind of catch-all term, they're really looking at the first instances of it, the Bitcoin blockchain or the Ethereum blockchain, which are general purpose and kind of first iterations of this wave of experimentation we're going to be seeing. And the problem with general purpose solutions is, well, they're just that. They're not very good at particular nuances or niches. So we're going to see a Cambrian explosion of protocols designed for specific purposes that prize efficiency and waste or e-waste, privacy, self-sovereignty, and an economic framework which enables those transactions to be viable. So, for example, IOTA enables feeless microtransactions in a way that, for example, the Ethereum protocol doesn't. If you look at Bitcoin, a transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain would cost often more than the transaction itself. So that's just not scalable when you're talking about the machine-to-machine economy and very small microtransactions. So something like IOTA specifically is designed for machine-to-machine microtransactions.
Clearly, we are going to have these autonomous agents performing a lot of actions, and there's going to be monetization involved. And this leads me to thinking about labor issues in the future of our ultra-efficient cities. And obviously, someone that can talk about this is Andrés Camacho, as the services that you provide for cities. Our services are labor-intensive, so the more data we use, the more likely it is that we will not need so many people. So what is going to happen?
Yeah, well, that is actually true in many occasions. And I think the issue now is that the institutional framework that at least companies like ours have to deal with local authorities, it doesn't allow us to actually implement changes in our contracts, because as you pointedly say, it could imply a reduction in labor. And I think this is where we need the help of the local authorities, because what we need to do is to take those people, okay, who are at the moment, let's say, cleaning the streets or emptying the bins. If you can do that more efficiently, you can use that people, or let's say the equivalent amount of FTEs or people, to do things that are probably of more social value for the citizens and for the city, like social care, taking care of the elderly people, or education. And it's going to be, as you were saying, Francesca, before, it is the fourth revolution coming, and there will be big changes in labor. Okay, so people are going to have and change their jobs. There will be new jobs, but many will be destroyed. And I think we all need to act with responsibility and flexibility to make sure that at the end of the day we have the, let's say, same number of people or even more number of people working, but doing things that are of more value. But at the moment, I'm afraid that, at least in my experience, the institutional framework, the contracting rules, the way we interact with the local authorities doesn't allow for that.
Francesca, you have a new model for Barcelona for procurement. Are issues like labor or data management included into this plan?
Yes, I think, actually the problem is much bigger in scale. I think local authorities have a role here, but the issue is really big. I think what he was saying, this is the first industrial revolution in history, which will destroy more jobs than it creates, and this is clear. And also it's gonna, we are seeing a massive automation on manufacturing, of logistics, of labor-intensive sectors, and definitely the gig economy, which is the opposite of solving the problem, because basically it creates more precarization, it creates flex jobs, jobs on call, our contracts that you have in the UK, where workers cannot, they're not even defined as workers because they're defined as contractors. And we saw a big legal case with Uber that Uber lost for this reason. So I think we really have to find a way to tackle this problem of what will happen to the world of jobs and labor. And I think we need to be sure that these systems are labor preserving. That labor rights are respected in the way that this platform economy works, for instance. On what we can do, at the level of the City Hall, we have done a reform of procurement where we integrated new clauses which mandate, labor justice, minimum wage, gender justice, environmental impact, and also the question of data ownership and ethical use of data, and also free software and open standards and all these kind of things. But I do think, for instance, that we talk very little about the big transformation that is happening in the future of work, and we have to, for instance, I'm a big advocate of basic income, but not as a replacement of the welfare state. So I'm actually really in agreement with what you were saying, that we are creating needs for new jobs that go into care, education, healthcare, mobility, and this is the welfare state, traditionally speaking, at least in Europe. And the public sector and the states have provided these kind of services to citizens in an egalitarian way. Now we risk to have a destruction of the welfare state, and on top of that, to say to young people that there is no future jobs and also there is no income. So I think we should institute a basic income. Actually, we should use, there was a lot of talks about the robot tax and so on, which I think it's not a good idea, but definitely productivity increases that come from the fourth industrial revolution and robotization. We should use it to incentivize, the new mechanism to create jobs, fair jobs. One could be create a fund for a basic income it provides a guaranteed income to the population. So I'm a big advocate of that. And then we can even think about other means. Some people are discussing data tax, which is about, that the regulators, in particular the European Commission, is now doing a lot of work to try and regulate the platform economy in Europe, at least. And one of the problems is that big companies not paying taxes in Europe. And one idea could be, to use to share the revenue. Trillions of dollars that will be made out of digitalization and robotization to try and create funds and direct funds, for instance, for basic income, or direct the productivity increase to social infrastructure that society needs.
Brilliant, thank you. So this really poses some questions regarding the relationship between the public and the private, and how in cities we might enable new modes of procurement that are fairer and so on. And that made me think of you, Andrew, because I remember working as a consultant in smart city programs in London. We found out that many of the physical infrastructure in the city was actually in hands of private companies, making it harder for the city council to tap into that data and ensure the data doesn't fall into silos. What can you tell us about that?
It's been fascinating listening to everybody's comments, so I'll try and sort of touch on those as well. I think what struck me is that we have a situation where public servants are very good at writing documents, or at least in my part of the world they are, and actually we really need to move beyond that. We produced a city data strategy in London a couple of years ago, and I think the speed with which this agenda is moving and technology is converging means that we have to really concentrate hard on active engagement with a lot of the sort of bodies represented here on this panel today, and as Francesca has said, with the publics that we serve, actually. And the reason why is that underneath all of this, in a city like London at least, and I'll be perfectly prepared to admit this, I think we live in a state of sort of deep data disorganization. Now, again, do we ever want to really control data in London? Could City Hall ever aspire to that? Of course we couldn't. But actually setting down a framework by which we can sort of exploit the value of data remains really important. And there's another example that I'll give to illustrate this point about data disorganization, and it touches on your point about public-private or private sector control over data that might be considered to be public, or the property, or to have a sort of wider ownership. And we did an exercise with Nesta, who you used to work for, I think, Francesca, yeah. And that was about trying to identify rogue landlord activity in a city like London. So overcrowded homes, cramming people into accommodation where fewer families should live. And this was one of those exercises where we were trying to bring together those municipal authorities that I was talking about before, of which there are 33 in London. We managed to get to a stage after, well, it took us 5 months to get to a stage where we had 5 London boroughs who had data wrangled 5 data sets into a position where they could be used in a machine learning exercise, usually used to identify fraud, that passed in the blink of an eye. And so there's a huge logjam in those sorts of exercises, and if you're thinking about taking advantage of relatively new disciplines like machine learning to have a positive, sort of valuable impact on public service delivery in London, then we're still quite some way off, quite frankly, being able to achieve that. And there are various ways in which we can do that. We have a sort of new city data store coming to life that will be all about using schema identification to drive some of the common standards and interoperability that we need to reduce that 5 months down. So data disorganization, really, it's a serious problem. And that is because some of that data is owned in the private sector, or at least it's kept in the private sector. And some of this is in really human services as well, like adult social care. And I suppose the interesting conversation that I'd like to have after this panel is, well, actually, how do you use blockchain to drive a more strongly regulated social housing market in London, or private rented sector in London? How do you get blockchain to be applied properly in adult social care so that choice is a simpler thing based on stronger identification. There's some really interesting questions in there. And it's been brought up already, this point about data extractivism. And to me, it's a really serious issue that we have to get on top of in city governments. And I think I mentioned the example of Toronto and the waterfront and the redevelopment there that will be brought forward underneath this sort of Google urbanism project, where Sidewalk Labs have really strong intentions to engage with the local community, I think, but this is about installing sensor networks, harvesting the data off those sensor networks as people move around and live in this place. But what happens to that data afterwards, I think, is still a moot point as to who owns it and how it's used. And this is not me saying, oh, this should be city halls or public sector good, private sector bad. It's just that there are these new business models that are emerging. I think data extractivism sounds like a horrible term, but City Hall needs to be aware of these things, and it needs to have a front foot and, you know, and strong regulatory approach to them. Because when push comes to shove, and Francesca, you've got a political boss just like I have, if things don't go to plan, then the fingers will be pointed at the political leadership in the city and not the private sector organisation who might not be so prominent at that stage.
If I may, if I may say something, I think he's touching one very important question, which is who owns what at the end, and also what kind of regulatory framework and access framework we need for this data ecosystem and data economy. And I think if you look at some of the cities, for instance, are pioneering some of these possible new regulation in the case of facing companies like Uber and Airbnb. And this, of course, the problem cannot be dealt at a city scale only. I really believe that there is a national level. In Europe, we have a European level. But definitely, we saw more and more that cities, to enforce local regulation, for instance, we had Airbnb about how many days you can rent your home, or you have to register in a local registry and so on. The problem was that there wasn't access to the data in order to know what was really happening on the platform. And the question of, I think, algorithmic and data transparency there was really key. And some of the cities started saying to Uber and Airbnb and the big data platforms, if you want to operate in our city, you need to open up the access to the data and the algorithms, because we have to be able to regulate, to make sure that you obey to the local legislation. And this also is a big request from the European Commission. I was listening to Angela Merkel saying a big speech in front of tech companies and big industry saying, data and algorithmic transparency is really important, because otherwise we don't know how to regulate it. We don't know what we are doing. So it's black boxes, and we cannot live in a society of black boxes. We need to know how this is going to affect pricing, it's going to affect your insurance, your ability to access to government services. We really need to bring a new deal on data, as I like to say in this space.
Can I come in super quickly, really quickly, because it relates to Jaimes' challenge, which is that you were saying that do we have a requirement to actually have super responsive services and systems, but actually what we have are a set of regulations and laws that move much more slowly and don't accommodate for that at the moment.
Just to build on that, because I think it's a really important point. This balance between top-down and bottom-up innovation, and obviously I'm a capitalist, so I favour private innovation, but I think the opportunity here is slightly different. So if you look at how value has consolidated into a few monopolies through Web 2, principally as a way that it was financed. The opportunity here is for the state, in whatever form, to set the rules of the game. And the great thing about blockchains and ledgers is you can literally hard code the rules into the ledger. So it's compliant by design, and then that could be privacy protecting and whatever else it may be. And then you can open it up as a data market. And I think it's much more likely that we'll get the solutions that you as leaders of smart cities programs will want, rather than trying to have 5 machine learning guys within your central office trying to sort through this ocean of data, to open it up and allow the private sector to innovate on top. But at the same time, I think, and this is again setting the rules of the game, there needs to be proper policy in place to ensure that that decentralization really does happen. And that can be realized in many forms. I think it's a fine balance, but I think it's something, a hybrid of that that's going to allow for the most innovation.
So we are getting questions from the audience. I also want to remind you that there are 2 microphones in the aisles that you can stand up and ask your questions. One of them is about, it's for Andrew, and it's about how you're going to tackle mobility challenges facing legislative pressure, taking into account the Uber ban.
Sorry, how are we going to tackle?
Yeah, are you going to continue promoting data-led mobility after the Uber ban or other policy restrictions in London?
Yeah, good. Good. What's my answer?
Sorry, I have to ask.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thanks a lot.
I can help you out if you want.
I tell you what, you ponder it. The public servant will ponder it. You answer it.
Well, so just coming back to what I was alluding to, there is the opportunity. What is the solution to? In all honesty, nobody really wants Uber. Most people just use it because it's convenient, and sadly, people generally choose convenience and user experience over ethics. But there are already innovations happening in blockchain. I think there are at least 5 instances where groups of drivers have unionized and they've created decentralized versions of Uber. So basically, they own the equivalent of Uber whilst removing the rent that Uber takes in the middle. So actually, it's even cheaper than Uber could be. And obviously, they're tax-paying individuals, so they're more socially responsible. So this is a really good example. And so what could happen is the state of Barcelona and the city of Barcelona could, Freudian slip, could actively promote a decentralized alternative that is owned by the drivers.
Yeah.
And that becomes policy. So it's almost you have a monopoly on being able to create decentralized alternatives to what are otherwise centralized monopolies.
So talking about business models and how you may invest in public infrastructure without risking the numbers of the city council or labor and so on, what can you tell us, Ravi, about new ideas for investing in IoT, for example, at scale? I imagine this is something problematic for city councils. How do they invest in such large-scale infrastructure? Who ends to own it, and so on? What are your ideas?
Yeah, that question comes up quite a bit when technology is discussed, and obviously, capital can become very, very intense when it comes to deploying things like a digital signage network or a kiosk network across the city and stuff like that. But I should point out that there is innovative business models that technology companies in collaboration with, for example, private equity banks that can partner together in a kind of a private-public partnerships model and be able to invest into these kind of deployments where it eases the burden on the cities and have the private equity partners kind of take that responsibility and burden on them. So there are innovative business models that are happening to change some of the capital expense that's involved and turn that into more of an operational expense. And there is several cases that has worked out, and obviously we want to see more and more of that happening because there are value-added services that either the cities or the operators or in that private-public partnerships they could work towards and generate enough revenue to recapture some of that initial capital expense that goes into it. So there's innovation happening in the business model side as well, and we would love to share more of that and some of the examples. As the examples grow in size, hopefully more and more cities would take advantage of those.
So clearly this requires a lot of transformations from the company and city perspective in terms of management and bureaucracy and so on. You have a lot of experience, Andrés, working in the intersection between private companies and city councils. Are private companies and city councils ready to adopt these new models and walk into the future with confidence?
Okay, my controversial answer would be no. Okay.
No one is.
I think for private companies like ours, and we are a services business, we are labor intensive, we mainly deal with people, which is different to, for example, Intel, that is very technological oriented. And we need to embrace technology more and smarter. We need to partner more with companies like Intel, for example, and I think we are not quite ready there. And regarding the public sector, I don't think they have the flexibility yet. Okay, I think, again, the contractual models are very rigid. It's difficult to set up frameworks in which we can share innovation because the way the contracts are are built, and I think we were discussing it before. I think we need to find ways to change the institutional framework to make sure that we work together in a new era. This is, I mean, it is changing. I think the world is changing faster than the agents, actually.
So I should give the voice to the cities to answer that, but I'm going to prioritize this gentleman that is standing in front of the microphone. So could you introduce yourself and address the question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Mara. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Arvinder. I'm the CTO of Urban Logic. We are a startup. We work with city governments to break data silos to help understand their city better and enable their citizens. I go back to a question by Jaimes about not innovating fast enough, and I think part of the problem is the hurdles for the startups to work with city governments. Procurement is one of them, but the other one is the data, the formats of the data that the city typically produces, and for startups to be able to, there is no consensus between different governments. What are your thoughts on these things about finding certain consensus about how the cities are producing the data so that there is enough room for startups to have the cost of the innovation becomes lower and the barriers become lower to innovate? Thank you.
That's a question to me, yeah. So there's some really interesting innovations around data to enable a kind of more equal playing field for especially those startups that are trying to innovate in the space of AI. So IOTA are also doing large pilots now around being able to sell data into data marketplaces. There's also another initiative called Ocean. Ocean was founded by some AI guys that more recently got into blockchain, and any AI startup will tell you the problem is having access to data to even begin to do anything interesting. So again, they've created an environment whereby you can tap into kind of stores of data that may otherwise be not being put to use. So I'm sure there are many organizations and companies here in the audience that have more data than they know what to do with. But as you said, they can't really put it to use, and it might be not standardized in the right way. So something like Ocean is looking to create a kind of standardization of data sets, whereby you can just put machine learning on it and away you go, and that kind of levels the playing field.
Is there another question? Yes? Well, I don't know. You're standing there next to the microphone.
Yes, yes, I tried. Thank you. Actually, I would like to react because we are one of these blockchain companies. I present myself. I'm Tom de Blok of Settlement in Belgium. We are already a long time past the experimental phase. Specifically, we have one data broker component, which we are trying to extend our alliance. Now, the question I have is more, also we share ideology in our space. It's not just about technology. The revolution is driven by people and technology. So what we see, if we try to engage with big corporates, like some of you, we go into a wall. Because actually what we see is that these corporates, they try to privatize the technology. They try to develop private instances of which should be a decentralized service. So, and that's actually in line with what the person just before me asked. How can we actually engage with cities without being blocked by the big corporates? How can we actually build true citizen engagement by autonomous and decentralized systems, which we offer today, but we are trying to engage and we go into walls?
So I will give that answer to Francesca and then possibly to Andrew.
We're extremely prioritizing to work with small companies, actually. If you think about it, like even in Spain, 90% of the companies are small companies. They're not large corporates. And I do recognize a tremendous inertia in the public sector. I think it was said also here before, in the public sector, like the relationship that we have, the contractual model, the frameworks that we operate are very obsolete. And we need to move from a contractual relationship that favor only few companies, usually big companies that have easy access, in particular in procurement regulation, which is where big deals are made. We need to move to a partnership framework. In Barcelona, for instance, not only we're reforming procurement, but also really investing in innovation procurement, and we are creating this online marketplace, like a digital marketplace, where it's much easier for smaller companies to participate and interact with cities. And we really hope, and we're already having a big impact, because definitely, you know, we see a much broader interaction. We're also moving to agile methodologies in the creation of services, and we are doing as much as possible to mandate and invest on open standards, open source software, interoperability, open interfaces, like anything that can actually favor that then you have open APIs that are well documented, and developers can access high quality data. So we're really doing, I think, our best. We even actually have an horizontal platform, it's called CTOS in Barcelona, which is standardizing the ontology. So not only we are publishing quality data, and this goes to the question before, that we are really controlling and is machine readable and is good quality data, but we are also then standardizing the ontologies and moving to open architectures, to microservice architecture with open APIs documented for startups and developers. And then we are creating a framework on top that is about decentralization, privacy aware, privacy enhancing, and rights respecting data ecosystem that I think it will go in the direction of getting much more of your talent to be able to build on common resources and common infrastructure to create services.
Okay. And into that platform, do you also buy from citizens, or you only offer? No, yes, the innovative public procurement is about scaling that and buy from citizens and startups and companies, exactly. Because this is also moving, even in the smart city field, from just test beds and experimentation into more solid buying of services that we can offer in the digital marketplace. Also, smaller company, a global opportunity to really scale these decentralized, privacy-aware solutions. I really think we need to do more of that, and I wish, we are doing also our best to create alliances among cities, like network of cities that are working in these directions, because I think we really need to give these guys like a much better opportunity.
Do you want to have a final comment? We are running on extra time, so we need to be...
Well, I can be super quick and say that I agree with everything that Francesca said, and that London is doing largely similar with regards to open data architectures, making sure that the standard and the frequency with which we bring forward data is sufficient to make sure that the ecosystem can feed on it appropriately. The only other thing I'd say super quickly is, in London we have a habit of pursuing research and development grants from our own innovation agency, the European Commission, we have commercialized or helped SMEs in London commercialize things like actually a long-term sort of scenario planning platform using London's data and some of our in-house experience. The big issue in London is aggregating demand, and I'll finish on this point. Getting those 33 municipal authorities to have a common view about what they need out of the technology market, and to use a rather old-fashioned word, but the SMEs is really, really important, and that's why we're trying to establish this thing called the London Office of Technology and Innovation, not an office with walls and a roof with lots of data scientists in it, but just a sort of collaborative framework in which we much more clearly identify our sort of technology and database needs for the future.
Brilliant.
I'm going to add one thing quickly onto the end of that, because I think I've seen similarities in the corporate world. We've helped our portfolio engage with corporate partners. And from my experience in the public sector, generally they are mandated to work with SMEs and smaller businesses. The problem is they're in a catch-22, because working with a startup is difficult when you might not be there next year, right? And 90% of startups fail, and all value is lost. And especially if you're going to start integrating into processes and value chains and new technology, that's very problematic. And again, this is why I think what's so exciting about this next period of the web is that largely it's going to be open source. And so that makes it much more easy for an organization to adopt it and integrate into it, because even if the company fails, the technology will still be there.
Thank you very much. I am aware that you're probably very hungry. Just to wrap up, clearly there's huge opportunity for data in terms of fostering new forms of planning and management of the city. But this doesn't come for free. There are many challenges associated to who owns the data, how to not keep data trapped in silos, how to make it interoperable, the promises of emergent technologies that at the same time do not necessarily provide right now the robustness and reliability that cities require, and also how to empower people. I would ask you to put your hands together for this stellar panel. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.